Sandwich Street, Windsor, Ontario, February 1930, 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. Constable Leo Marentet, Windsor Police, 9 years on the riverfront beat, stopped at the foot of the dock lane and read the river before he read the street. The Detroit River was 600 meters wide here, and it was frozen. Not evenly, never evenly. And the shore ice below the export dock carried a set of tire tracks that had not been there when he passed at 11. Across the water, Detroit was lit. Behind him, the dock shed showed one lamp where it usually showed none. He was not a customs officer. He was not a federal officer. Nothing at that dock was necessarily his to interfere with. And after 9 years, he knew exactly which parts of what he was looking at were legal, which were merely federal, and which were the small, specific fraction that belonged to a municipal constable walking a border town at night, the town's order, the town's traffic, the town's people. What was happening on the ice was, in strict jurisdictional terms, mostly someone else's problem. But he had stopped anyway, because 9 years on this beat had taught him that the dock lamp and the tire tracks were not two facts. They were one fact, and it had a third part that a man in his first winter on this street would not have looked for. The boathouse 200 meters east, dark, with the ice in front of it cut. Marentet read the three together the way he read the weather, not as evidence for a charge, but as the condition of his town at 10 past 2. Whatever was crossing that ice tonight would come back through his streets, his hotels, his corners, before morning. A police report could record what he did next. No report ever recorded what he had just done. The reading itself, the 9 years compressed into 30 seconds of looking. So the question the frozen river asks is this: what exactly had 9 winters on one riverfront beat built in a Windsor constable, and why did a border town, of all postings, build it faster and stranger than anywhere else in Canada? What 9 winters had built in Marentet? We will get there. First, you need to see how many different kinds of police were standing on that one riverbank, because a border town was the most jurisdictionally crowded territory in Canada, and the municipal constable held the smallest and strangest piece of it. The border cities, Windsor, Sandwich, Walkerville, East Windsor, each ran its own municipal force in this era. 4 small departments along a few kilometers of international riverfront. Above them worked the Ontario Provincial Police. On the federal layer sat the customs and excise officers of the Department of National Revenue, whose preventive service watched the water itself. And after April 1932, the RCMP absorbed that preventive service whole, its men, and the patrol boats that became the RCMP Marine Section, putting the federal force directly onto the Detroit River. 4 uniforms, 1 shoreline, and no shared radio net connecting any of them, because there was no radio. Marentet's communication system in 1930 was the call box on the corner of Sandwich Street, a telephone line to the station, used at fixed points on fixed rounds, and beyond it, nothing but his own judgment. The department's patrol car, when the beat had one, carried no two-way set. An officer who saw something on the ice at 10 past 2 decided alone, on foot, in the cold, what it was and whose it was. The institution could tell him where to walk. It could not see what he saw. And here is the operational core of the border beat. The customs officer's territory ended at the legal definition of the goods. The constable's territory was everything the goods did to the town: the money, the cars, the strangers, the hotels, the fights, the families. The federal system watched the border. Marentet watched what the border was doing to Windsor. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place built in the officer who walked the same riverfront in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology, the documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did 9 years on one riverfront beat give a Windsor constable about the docks, the ice, and the town that no customs manifest and no dispatch log was ever designed to hold? And if you served in the RCMP or provincial police in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If your family served with a border cities force, the OPP, Customs, or the RCMP preventive service on the Windsor or Niagara frontier, what did they say a quiet night on the riverfront actually meant? Next, the RCMP Marine Section's first winter on the Detroit River, 32 boats inherited in April, and a river that freezes in December. Back on the grid road, or here, back on the riverfront. Because before you can understand what Marintet knew, you have to understand the strangest fact of his territory. Most of what crossed that river left Canada legally. So what, exactly, was against the law? What was against the law? Less than you would think. And that is the fact that made the Windsor beat unlike any other posting in the country. Ontario had banned the sale of liquor under the Ontario Temperance Act in 1916. The United States banned it nationally under the Volstead Act in January 1920. But Ontario's law never banned making liquor, and Canadian federal law never banned exporting it. The distilleries of Walkerville ran legally at full capacity through the driest decade in North American history. A boat at a Windsor export dock could be loaded in daylight, in front of a constable, in front of a customs officer, with a federal B-13 clearance document stamped for Cuba or Venezuela, and everyone on that dock, in uniform or out of it, knew the boat would be in Detroit in 20 minutes. The paper was legal, the load was legal, the departure was legal, the lie was on the destination line, and the destination was another country's problem. The scale of it settled onto this one stretch of water. Contemporary estimates hold that roughly 3/4 of all the liquor smuggled into the United States during Prohibition crossed through the Windsor-Detroit funnel, a river you could row in minutes, dotted with islands, frozen into a road every winter, when runners drove light 6-cylinder cars across the ice because a light car might survive what a heavy one would not. Now put Marintet back on Sandwich Street. He could not arrest the export trade. Most of it was not a crime in Canada. What the trade left behind in his town, however, was entirely his. The roadhouses and blind pigs serving liquor that was illegal to sell in Ontario, the American visitors, the cash, the men from Detroit whose business in Windsor was never on any manifest, and the ordinary families of a border town living inside all of it. The federal officers watched a legal river. The constable policed an altered town, which raises the real question of the beat. If the law could not describe most of what was happening, what did Marintet actually use to police it? And what had 9 years given him that the law never could? What Marintet used was not in any statute. Published histories of the border cities' forces and regional police records for comparable beats in this decade describe the same body of knowledge, built the same slow way, and it had 4 parts. First, the water. 9 winters had taught him what the river ice did, where the current under the Sandwich shore kept it thin when it looked thick, which cold snaps made a road of it, and what cut ice in front of a dark boathouse meant about the night's traffic. He had not been taught this. Nobody teaches a constable ice. The river had taught him, 1 winter at a time. Second, the rhythm. A border town has a pulse, ferry times, shift changes at the plants, the hours the export docks worked, the nights the American traffic came over heavy. 9 years had calibrated him to it so precisely that his real instrument was deviation, the lamp lit where no lamp should be, the car parked facing the wrong way, the quiet that was the wrong kind of quiet. A first-year man saw a peaceful street. Marintet saw a street holding its breath. Third, the people. He knew which hotel keeper would tell him things and which would tell him nothing, which young men rode for money and which families feared it, who on his beat was in the trade, near the trade, or being slowly bent by the trade. This was the insider's knowledge, and it worked like a man knowing the rooms of his own house in the dark. He did not deduce it, he moved through it by feel, and he had acquired it the only way it can be acquired, by bumping into the furniture, once, years ago, and remembering. Fourth, and this was the border specialty, he knew what belonged to whom, which situations were customs business, which were the provinces, which would vanish if pushed and reappear worse elsewhere. A quiet riverfront was not the absence of the trade. It was the trade managed. None of this was written down, which raises the question the institution never asked. While the constable was learning the town, what was the federal layer learning about the river, and what changed on that water in 1930 and again in 1932? 2 dates rebuilt the federal layer under Marintet's feet. In 1930, Ottawa moved against the open fiction of the export docks, choking off the clearance system that had let boats stamp papers for Havana and steer for Detroit. The daylight trade dimmed. The trade itself did not stop. It went darker, smaller, faster, and more of it went at night, which meant more of it passed through the hours that belonged to the beat constable rather than the customs counter. Then, on the 1st of April 1932, the RCMP absorbed the preventive service of the Department of National Revenue whole. 32 patrol boats and 246 officers and men transferred over, and the RCMP Marine Section was born. A federal police navy, part of it now working the same dark water Marintet read from the shore. For the first time, the force of the Red Surge was a border town waterfront force, chasing motor launches instead of riding prairie sections. And Windsor was only the widest point of the funnel. 300 kilometers east, the same architecture repeated on the Niagara frontier. Niagara Falls, Fort Erie, Bridgeburg, where the Peace Bridge opened in 1927 and put a paved road across the border, just as Ontario ended its own prohibition, and the LCBO began selling liquor a short drive from the American line. Documented cases from the era show the scale. Hamilton's Rocco Perry moved liquor by the trainload into the United States through Niagara Falls and Windsor. On the Niagara River, the water was faster, the towns smaller, the crossings tighter. But the constable's problem was identical: a legal Canadian shore, an illegal American one, and a town in between that the officer had to know person by person, dock by dock, night by night. The federal boats knew the river, the bridge knew the traffic. Neither knew the town. Published histories of the border forces in this decade keep arriving at the same quiet fact. Every layer of the system above the beat constable could be reorganized, renamed, transferred by order in council, and none of it moved what he knew. So what did the town know about him? What was the border community's side of this relationship? And what did it look like in full, including the parts the institution preferred not to photograph? A border town is not a line, it is a community that happens to live on both sides of one. Windsor families had relatives in Detroit. Thousands of border cities workers rode the ferry to American plants each morning and rode it home each night. Marriages, funerals, hockey games, paychecks, all of it crossed the water as routinely as the weather did. When national prohibition redrew the legal meaning of that water in 1920, it did not redraw the community. It simply made a portion of ordinary border life technically criminal and dropped the management of that contradiction onto the men who policed it. This is what the constable meant to the town, and it was double-edged. To most residents, Marintet was a known man, the officer who had attended their door for a lost child, a drowned swimmer, a store break-in, who knew which family was in trouble before the trouble had a file. Regional histories of small border forces in this era describe exactly this figure. An officer whose authority ran less on the statute book than on 10 years of being seen, at the same corners, in all weather. Disputes ended without charges because he knew the parties. Boys near the trade were walked home instead of booked, because he knew their fathers, and the same closeness cut the other way. In a town where a rowboat crossing paid more than a month of factory wages, the constable was policing his neighbors' incomes. Everyone knew him, which meant the trade knew him, his rounds, his corner, his habits. The Royal Commission on Customs and Excise in the 20s documented how deep the money had reached into the border services. The beat officer lived every night inside that pressure, known by name to people on both sides of it. Repeal came in 1933, and the fever broke. In 1935, the border cities amalgamated into a single Windsor, and 4 small forces began becoming one. The town Marintet knew was consolidating under his feet. But the community picture is not complete yet, because the institutions he wore the uniform of were doing other work in these same decades, in other communities, and honesty requires that it be in the frame. What was the full institutional context of Canadian policing between 1920 and 1960? Before you can understand what the border constable's knowledge was worth, you need to understand the full institution it existed inside, because the decades that produced Marintet's beat also produced other, documented work that the same uniforms carried out. In these same years, the RCMP that took over the Detroit River in 1932 was also assisting in the enforcement of the residential school system in indigenous communities. Attendance compelled, children removed. It was conducting surveillance and deportations of immigrants labeled radicals, with the Chinese and Ukrainian communities among those heavily targeted. It supplied special constables in labor disputes across the interwar period. And the labor side came home to the border itself. When the Great Ford Strike shut Windsor in 1945, provincial and federal reinforcements were massed toward the city, and strikers answered by blockading the plant with thousands of vehicles. The largest confrontation between police power and workers in the city's history, resolved, in the end, without the assault ever coming. Hold both facts without letting either erase the other. The knowledge in Marentet, the ice, the rhythm, the families, was real, humane in its ordinary uses, and operationally irreplaceable. The institutional record, residential school enforcement, deportation raids, strike policing, is also real, and it was carried out in the same decades, sometimes by officers with exactly the same kind of local knowledge, which is precisely what made the institution effective in those roles too. Local knowledge is a tool. The institution decided what it was pointed at. That is the honest frame, and this channel will not trade it for either mythology, not the Mountie who always gets his man, and not a history in which the constable reading the river at 2 a.m. never existed. Both stood on the same shoreline, which brings the story to its last movement. The war came, then the post-war world, and with it, the technology that would quietly end the border beat, as Marentet had known it. What arrived in the patrol car after 1945, and what did it start to replace? What arrived was the radio, and with it, a different theory of what a police officer needed to know. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s, two-way radio spread into Canadian patrol cars, and the amalgamated Windsor force, like forces across the country, rebuilt itself around the motorized, dispatched patrol. The change was genuinely operational. A car could be sent anywhere, told anything, redirected mid-shift. The dispatcher, for the first time, could see the whole city as a board of moving units. Records of comparable municipal forces in this decade document the same sequence everywhere. Fewer footbeats, more cars, wider zones, faster response. Look closely at what each change did to Marentet's kind of knowledge. The footbeat had produced the town's rhythm through repetition. The patrol zone rotated men through territory too wide and too fast to learn a doorway at a time. The known constable had produced the informal settlement. The boy walked home. The dispatched car produced the logged call and the report. The 9 winters of ice reading had existed because the officer was alone and unreachable. The radio meant no officer was ever quite alone again, and knowledge that exists to fill an institution's silence loses its urgency when the silence ends. At the border itself, the modern architecture hardened in parallel. The bridge and the tunnel replaced the ferry as the arteries. Customs at the crossings grew into a professional inspection system, and the RCMP's federal squads worked smuggling as investigation rather than as shoreline watching. Every layer became more capable, and every layer became less local. By 1960, where this channel's window on these towns closes, a constable could police the Windsor riverfront competently in his first year. The radio, the car, and the file system carried him. That was the achievement. The question underneath it is the one the whole system never asked out loud. When the last of the long-beat men went home, what exactly went home with them? If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more grid roads, more northern detachments, more dog sled crossings, more riverfronts read at 2 a.m, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. What did 9 years on one riverfront beat give a Windsor constable about the docks, the ice, and the town that no customs manifest, no radio log, and no dispatch board was ever designed to hold? And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. If your family served with a border city's force, the OPP, Customs, or the RCMP Preventive Service on the Windsor or Niagara frontier, what did they say a quiet night on the riverfront actually meant? Next on this channel, the RCMP Marine Section's first winter on the Detroit River. 32 boats inherited in April, and a river that freezes in December. Constable Leo Marentet's generation went home through the 1950s. The border city's forces he had shared a shoreline with had been one amalgamated department since 1935. The footbeats along the river were folded into radio patrol zones over the years that followed. What the new system gave Windsor: response in minutes, coverage by the map, an officer who could be anywhere. What it did not give the riverfront: a man who knew, From the shore, in the dark, what cut ice in front of a dark boathouse meant, and what it would mean in the town by morning. The patrol car that drove the riverfront zone in 1960 knew the streets from the map. It got there. It did not know which hotel keeper would talk, which family was being bent, or which quiet was the wrong kind of quiet. Marentet's generation had known. They had learned it from 9 winters and 30 years, one corner at a time. Nobody asked what they knew before they went home for the last time. The Detroit River still freezes unevenly along the Sandwich shore. The current has not changed. The knowledge is somewhere else now.